to do it, so. Actually, 11:59, that's when Blackwood closes it. Do not wait till 11:58 to start. We were talking about the so-called Roaring '20s. And as I was pointing out, technology is going to change the 1920s, going to change America. We talked about radio. The other technology, one of the other technologies that's going to have a huge impact are the movies. The 1920s was the first golden age of Hollywood. It's when it really came into its own. In fact, the first full-length movie wasn't even produced till 1917. So the 1920s really saw the growth of Hollywood. Now, initially, the film industry had been centered in New York. Why New York? Think about it, folks. Why was the film industry initially centered in New York? There are a lot of people there. What kind of people, though? Huh?
Rich people.
Yeah, there are rich people other
Yeah,
places.
it's maybe town, like, there's more of a, Broadway, was it already there?
Thank you.
Didn't know
You
it was
got
already
it.
there, but-
Yeah, because of Broadway, that's where the actors are. It was the center of American theater. They're going to move to Hollywood, they're going to move across the continent for several reasons. One, the weather in New York isn't all that good much of the year. And remember, a lot of the early movies needed natural light. They were shot outside. It's kind of hard to shoot outside in New York in February. And you don't have a lot of the different scenic locations you need for movies. There aren't any deserts around New York, for example. And a third reason, to get the hell away from Thomas Edison. Edison believed that since he invented the first really workable movie projector, that he owned the movie industry. He made his own films. There was an Edison Film Company. And he would use his connections with local judges and the police to harass competitors. So for a variety of reasons, the film industry relocates out in California. Ironically, one other reason, the land was cheap. There was nothing out there. Los Angeles was not the city it is today. They bought up most of the land for the big studios in Hollywood dirt cheap. Can you imagine that today? You know what real estate goes for in Hollywood and Burbank? Back then they got it for pennies an acre. Nobody else wanted it. So they could build huge studios out there. And if you've ever been out to California in February or when it's bad weather back east, it's usually beautiful out there. Los Angeles really doesn't get all that much rain. It is semi-desert itself. So you got a lot more days you can shoot. And within 50 miles, you have damn near every type of scenery you need. You have the ocean, you have lakes, you have desert, you have forest, you have mountains. And the other reason, it's close to Mexico. If Edison harasses you out there, you can always head down to Mexico for a while till the heat's off. So for all those reasons, they relocated out in Hollywood, and the movie industry takes off. This is the silent era of movies. And the first famous movie stars were people like Rudolph Valentino, Theda Bara, Clara Bow, Charlie Chaplin, Lon Chaney. Even back then, Hollywood was inventing romantic backgrounds and adventurous backgrounds for the stars. Theda Bara, who was one of the biggest female stars in Hollywood in the early years, she was supposed to be an exotic Middle Eastern princess, the daughter of an Englishman and an Egyptian princess. Her real name was Gladys Jones, and she was from Cincinnati, Ohio. That's not exactly exotic, is it? So even back then, they were inventing rather adventurous past for the actors. Now, in 1927, the first talkie debuts. The first movie with sound. Anybody know what it was? The Jazz Singer. And it actually starred a jazz singer, Al Jolson. It wasn't necessarily an actor. That was the first movie with sound. And after that, that's going to take off. It's funny, some of the studio heads initially didn't want to mess with it because it was expensive, the early sound quality was bad and all that, and they really didn't think it was necessary. They asked the head of the Warner Studios, Warner himself, if he was going to make talkies, and his initial reaction was, who the hell wants to hear actors talk? That changed within a year. Now, radio in the movies is going to have a profound effect on American culture. The 1920s saw a lot of social change as well as technological change. The fact that women got the right to vote was empowering. Plus, you have millions of young women who are now entering the workforce. Women had always worked, but it was largely poor women, working in textile factories or on farms or things like that. Now women are beginning to enter into what they call pink-collar jobs in the 20s. What's a pink-collar job? What does it sound like?
She's working right alongside the blue collars.
No, the colors would clash.
Well, you know, so the pink collar job.
No, that's a good guess, but
Doing work assembly line,
no.
doing what men would be particularly doing.
Yeah, actually, the reason they call them pink collar jobs is because they differ. No, not necessarily. Yeah.
More like feminine style jobs, maybe like nursing and like childcare in general.
Nursing, childcare, secretarial, clerical, those were all considered pink collar jobs. And you see a lot of women entering the workforce in those jobs. The image of women changes in the 1920s. Before the 1920s, it was more of the, quote, Gibson girl. Wifely, maternal, incapable of immodest thought or deed. That changes. What's the stereotype of the young woman in the 1920s? And Flappers. How'd they get their name? Yeah. Why'd they call them flappers? Well, it's kind of hard to tell from what they're wearing in that picture. Let me give you another name. Or another picture, anyway. Well, that one doesn't have a lot on it. A lot of the dresses they wore had tassels on them, and they flapped when they danced. So they were called flappers. That's how they got their nickname. The flappers had a reputation of being wild, and they did flout certain social conventions. For the 1920s, women did not go into saloons unless they were hookers or something like that. But they didn't patronize them. They didn't go in there and order a beer. Saloons were, man's world back then. Well, with the speakeasies, it's a different story. You see just as many women in most of the speakeasies as you see men. So women are actually going out in public and doing things they had never done before. My God, they smoked cigarettes in public. That was considered really scandalous. I know, things have changed, haven't they? So the flappers were more liberated. They weren't necessarily wild. What they really were liberated working class women. These pink collar jobs, working class jobs. Women finally, a lot of young women, finally had independent incomes. They weren't dependent on a man anymore. And they're showing their liberation. That's what the flappers really were. They were not as much wild as they were liberated. Another technology that's going to change America and its morals is the automobile. Now, cars were nothing new in the 1920s. They had been around for nearly 50 years at that point. The thing is, before the 1920s, they were largely the toys of the rich. Cars were expensive. Some of them were hand-built. So owning a car was a sign of wealth. That begins to change. In 1908, Henry Ford begins to produce the first Model T. That's the first affordable car for the middle and working class. Now, he did it by using a moving assembly line. And contrary to what people may have told you in the past, he did not invent the assembly line. The French did during the French Revolution in the 1780s. That's how old the assembly line was. He didn't even invent the moving assembly line, and he wasn't even the first one to apply it to automobile manufacturing.
He wasn't?
No.
The first one to mass produce the.
Nope, not to apply moving assembly line. He gets credit for inventing a highly reliable but simple vehicle that could produce cheaply, and he also did it better than everybody else. He didn't invent the moving assembly line, but he perfected it. He did it better than any of the other manufacturers. And he was producing a car, like I said, that was reliable, easy to maintain, and affordable. Between 1908 and 1927, over 15 million Model Ts were produced. In fact, by the end of World War I already, half the cars in America were Model Ts. No other car's ever been that dominant. He kept doing everything he could to drive the price down. By 1925, you could buy a Model T for only $260. And keep in mind, the average middle class salary was around $1,800, $2,000, right around there. So you can see how this is kind of affordable, isn't it? They're very basic, nothing fancy. Ford said you could get one in any color you like, as long as it was black. They had made other colors before 1914. They had gray, blue, and red, green. But to save money, after 1914, they only produced them in black. So if you wanted a different color, you had to buy one and have it repainted. Now, the growth of the auto industry has a tremendous ripple effect throughout the American economy. If you're building a lot of cars, what other industries is this going to impact? Please?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, gasoline. In the 1800s, they used to burn it off because they didn't have any use for it. Now, all of a sudden, they have a huge use for it, and you see gas stations springing up all over the place. What other industry does it stimulate? Well, what do you use in the manufacture of automobiles? Thank you. It helps stimulate the rubber industry. You need tires for all these cars and for other parts. What else? Yeah, it creates jobs. You're right about that. Creates jobs.
They need more food.
Actually, they're growing enough food. Come on, guys, think.
Mechanics, Jiffy Lube, stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, you get stuff like that springing up too. That's another industry.
It's an obvious.
Yeah.
Oil.
Well, with gasoline in that, you need oil and gasoline.
Glass.
Yeah, the glass industry.
Oh, they're all right.
Yeah, it stimulates the glass industry as well.
Does everything
No, not everything. Doesn't do anything for the anchovy industry. Nothing at all. You're missing the biggie. Yeah.
Like metal that they use in
And what metal in particular? Steel industry. There you go. Has huge effect on the steel industry. So all of these industries are impacted. On top of that, you need roads, don't you? So the states, not the federal government yet, the states go into a frenzy of road building. That also stimulates other industries, the asphalt industry, for example. It stimulates the tourist industry. It gives the average American a mobility they had never really had before. Plus, as I'll demonstrate, they now have more places to go on vacation. Florida, for example. The invention of commercial air conditioning had a lot to do with that. So you see the rise of a tourist industry in America. You see the rise of a motel industry. People need places to sleep at night, don't they? So the rise of the automobile has this tremendous ripple effect through the economy. And it's well on its way to replacing the railroads as the most dominant industry in America. And here's the car that was largely responsible for it, a mint condition Model T. Notice that one's kind of the olive green Maybe you can't tell. And here's a family in their Model T. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough room for the kid. He had to ride on the runner, but I'm kidding.
Is it the same Model T, same year, you mean? The other one,
Well, I have no idea.
selling that, when that fire truck?
They barely differed. He basically cranked out the same car for a couple of decades until it was totally obsolete.
Is that the same one they had to start sticking
The original ones you had to crank,
the?
yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, now you get in and push a button. Yeah, some of the early cars, you actually had to get out and crank them to turn them over.
They didn't have starters.
Didn't have starters, no. Yeah, driving cars early on was an adventure, folks. By the time you get a Model T, things have changed pretty much. Now, the 20s aren't roaring for everybody, and not everybody's comfortable with the rate of change. Anytime you get rapid social and technological change, you get a backlash from it. Because change benefits most people, doesn't benefit everybody, does it? Rapid changes of the 1920s. Many Americans were uncomfortable with the changing morale or morality in America. Things I mentioned before, flappers, women smoking cigarettes in public, things like that, were shocking a lot of people. A lot of them, as they do today, blame Hollywood and mass media. They blamed Hollywood and the radio. In fact, one of the most popular comedians in Hollywood was involved in a major scandal. Fatty Arbuckle. He was known for throwing wild parties, and a young woman who had attended one of his later died. Now, I want to point out that it was later established that her death was from natural causes. It had nothing to do with the party or anything she did at the party. But there was a rush to judgment. It turned into a huge scandal before the truth came out. Seemed to validate, incorrectly, what a lot of people were saying about Hollywood, and it ruined Arbuckle's career. But it was taken by many people as proof of Hollywood's decadence. As I pointed out, all he was guilty of was throwing a wild party. It had nothing to do with the young lady's death. In 1922, a prominent minister, John William Porter, published a book called The Dangers of the Dance. And remember, they're doing dances back then like the Charleston and the Foxtrot, and those were considered wild and vulgar. To be awfully tame compared to today, folks. You ever see film of anybody doing the Charleston something? Yeah. Doesn't look all that immoral, does it? No. It's actually rather tame. But to them, oh my God, this was going to bring down Western society as we knew it. Part of the reason had to do with racism. A lot of the popular dances originated among the African American community. The Charleston, which was all the rage in the 20s, actually was an old dance done by slaves on plantations in the South. It was called the Juba. But when whites discovered it, largely around South Carolina, they renamed it the Charleston. But there was always that underlying theme, especially with the dances and with jazz music, that there was something racial about it. The 1920s was a rather racist era in American history.
This is what the good Reverend John William Porter said about popular dances. He said they were syncopated embraces and that the modern dance is based upon and stimulates the sexual instinct, end quote. So no foxtrot or Charleston. Now, movies, to deflect criticism and forestall government regulation, the studio heads created the Motion Picture Association. And they had the Motion Picture Code. And they put a former Postmaster General, Will Hayes, in charge of it. It's often known as the Hayes Code. And it dictated largely what you folks could see in movies for the next 40 years. It finally breaks down in the wild and woolly 60s. There were certain rules. You could not show a man and a woman lying on a bed together. Under the rules, both of them had to have at least 1 foot on the floor. I know. Ridiculous as hell. You ever watch any old TV shows or movies? You ever notice that the married couples have separate beds? Mm-hmm. That's because of the Hayes Code. And it's ridiculous. Stifled the American movie industry for years. But it was a backlash, a result of a lot of people's fears of the changing morality in America. Others are afraid of the implications of modern science. In the early 1920s, the state of Tennessee, in its dubious wisdom, outlawed the teaching of evolution in public schools. How's that for freedom of education and freedom of speech? In the early 1920s. I don't remember the exact year. It was like 23 or 24. Now, in 1925, there's a major trial held over this law, the so-called Scopes Monkey Trial. And it was held in Dayton, Tennessee. Now, one would think this was an attempt to bring academic freedom and teach modern science. No, it was a publicity stunt. You see, the little town of Dayton, Ohio, or Dayton, Tennessee, not Dayton, Ohio, excuse me. Dayton, Tennessee was a backwater. It was one of those areas that had largely been passed over by the prosperity of the 1920s. And a local businessman, George Rappahallia, came up with the idea of staging the trial in the city to bring it some publicity. He had been talking with the biology teacher at the local high school, John Scopes. And they had been discussing the law, the new law, and he admitted frankly, he goes, I can't teach biology without teaching evolution. No biology teacher can. Every time we teach biology, we're breaking the law. And that gave Rappahallia the idea. So they actually alerted the authorities that he was doing that so he would get charged. And it worked. It brought huge publicity to the little town of Dayton. The anti-evolution crusade was led by a name you folks should be familiar with, William Jennings Bryan. And John Scopes was defended by one of the greatest lawyers of his time, Clarence Darrow. So you had a clash of giants in Dayton, Tennessee. If I say Ohio one more time. And there they are, Darrow and Bryan. And by the way, for all the fiery vehemence during the trial, the two men really liked and respected each other. They were both sincere about arguing their side, but there really wasn't any animosity between the two of them. Scopes, and nobody was surprised about this, was found guilty but given only a $100 fine. And that was later overturned on a technicality. But the trial does illustrate the gap between rural and urban America when it came to accepting a lot of this new science and a lot of the new technology. Now, towards the end of the 1920s, in 1928, we have a presidential election. The sitting president, Calvin Coolidge, announces that he's not going to run for re-election. And by the way, he never gives a reason. His wife did remark, oh, Cal's not running because he thinks there's a depression coming on. And of course, nobody took that seriously. Whether he actually knew that the Great Depression was approaching or not, chances are he didn't run because of his health. He was in poor health, declining health, and he dies relatively young. He's 61 years old when he dies in 1933. So it probably wasn't him predicting the future as much as bad health kept him from running for another term. Now, that means we have one of the more fun elections in American history, one with no incumbent running. An incumbent president normally, not in every case, but normally has the advantage in the election if they're running for re-election. In 1928, you have no incumbent. It's wide open. And speaking of wide open, now there we go. Now, since Coolidge isn't going to run, the Republicans nominate the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. The Democrats nominate the Governor of New York, Al Smith. Now, the election of 1928 is going to hinge on three different things. One of them is rather universal to most elections. Every presidential election, this is almost always a factor. So what's the one normally universal constant in a presidential election? What issue?
Maybe I can remember that.
Yeah.
You talking about what is the president today going to do the most?
No.
I think he probably did.
Okay, maybe I mumbled through it today. The election's going to turn on three major issues. And a couple of them, one's unique to the election, another one related more in the 20s, but one of them's universal. It's a factor in almost every election. What usually influences voters? You're on the right track.
Lowering taxes,
Not necessarily taxes, but
the military, we're talking about strengthening the military. I mean, you're going to do legalize, it's going to turn over, repeal prohibition,
actually, that wasn't what I was fishing for,
but he does.
but that's one of the issues in the election. So I'll go ahead and put that up here. That's the issue that's kind of unique to the 1920s.
That would make it pretty tough.
Yeah, that's going to be a major issue, isn't it? But again, I'm still fishing. What's the one that you see pop up in most elections? The economy, money. If the economy's good, the party in power usually gets credit, don't they? It helps them out. If the economy's bad, the public usually takes it out on the party in power. So this one's almost always a constant in most presidential elections. The third issue happens to be religion. Why is that an issue? Because Al Smith is a Catholic. He is the first Catholic ever to run on a major party ticket. Yeah, despite his Anglo-sounding name, he was actually Irish. He had been orphaned as a child and raised in an orphanage. Religion's going to be a major issue. There's fierce bigotry against him by some Protestants and some organizations. The Ku Klux Klan in particular. He's giving a campaign speech in Oklahoma City, and the Ku Klux Klan burns a cross out in front of the convention center. By the way, does that intimidate Smith? Well, hell no. He's a streetwise New Yorker. He calls them cowards and dares them to come into the convention center and confront him. And by the way, he's right. Anybody who hides under white sheets and burn crosses, they're cowards. They don't have the backbone to face him. Can you imagine that happening today? Now, I want to point out that the Hoover campaign had nothing to do with the bigotry against Smith. Nothing. This was other outside forces. Hoover had nothing to do with it, and he denounced it. Anybody know what religious denomination? Little hint, he wasn't Catholic.
What?
Wasn't.
Where is it from? What state?
Originally, he was born in Oregon.
In Mormon?
Good guess, but no. Quaker.
Quaker?
He was a Quaker. So there's bigotry, but it has nothing to do with the campaigns for either. Now, given the fact the economy's good, unfortunately there's religious bigotry. Oh, forgot the other issue. Both candidates differ on prohibition. Which one do you think favors repeal?
Smith?
There you go. Thank you. Yeah. The Irish Catholic from New York. Go figure, right? Yeah. Smith and the Democrats, by and large, favored repeal. And by the way, if you're against prohibition, you are a wet. That was a term for it. So Smith is a wet. Hoover is a dry. And by the way, Hoover didn't particularly like prohibition either. He figured it would sooner or later go by the wayside, but he was towing the party line on that one. When it's all said and done, Hoover wins a pretty convincing victory. Poor Al Smith doesn't even take his own home state. The only state he wins outside the South is Massachusetts. Hoover won with 58% of the popular vote and 444 electoral votes. Smith got only 41% of the popular vote. Interestingly enough, though, and this presaged the future, Smith lost the election, but he won all of America's top 10 cities. New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, they all went for Smith. And down the road, the urban vote's going to be decisive. Now, when Hoover took office, it's a time of prosperity and the economy is booming. People were optimistic. During his campaign, Hoover told his audience, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. We shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from the nation." Said that in 1928. Within about 3 years, we would be mired in the absolute worst economic depression ever to hit this nation and this planet. But in 1928, people were optimistic, thought the economy was booming. See, the new technologies and the new opportunities, it fostered a get-rich-quick mentality. Throughout the 1920s, there were several get-rich-quick schemes. 2 of them involved land booms. There was a huge Florida land boom and then a smaller Colorado land boom. Florida had not been a major tourist destination before the 1920s. In fact, you didn't see a lot of people living down there. Miami was a little town on the edge of the Everglades. The main reason was the climate. Hot, humid. I actually liked it when I lived down there, but a lot of people don't. It's the advent of commercial air conditioning. You start getting a huge tourist industry into Florida, and property values start going up. So a lot of speculators and entrepreneurs started buying up land in Florida on speculation. And then average people started buying land on speculation. Here's a flyer for a company selling land in Florida. And they would even schedule special trains to go down to Florida to sell you the land. Now, this led to a whole lot of fraud. People were buying land in Florida they had never seen. A lot of it was swampland. Some of it was dry during much of the time, but it was underwater during high tide. Kind of hard to build on. So there's a lot of fraud involved in this. Eventually, a few hurricanes, greed, and over-speculation led the bubble to burst. And the entire Florida land boom collapses. A lot of people lose their shirts on it. Same with the Colorado land boom. That takes off. A lot of fraud involved. People find out they're buying the sides of mountains. Makes it a little difficult to build on.
So after the land boom bust, the next big get-rich scheme is going to be the stock market. Speculation in the stock market. Now, it's true the market was rising. The big problem was that it was rising largely on speculation. A lot of the stock is being bought, to begin with, on borrowed money. Your broker would actually lend you the money to buy stock from them. It was called buying on margin. And you made regular payments like you would on a car or a house. It's the equivalent of a gambling casino lending you money to gamble. You could buy a lot of stock and put as little as 10% down on it. 90%. As long as you made regular payments and the cost or the price of that stock remained stable or rose, you were fine. If the price of the stock goes below what you initially paid for it, you had to make up the difference immediately. That was known as a margin call. So as long as the market's going up, you're fine. By October of 1929, right before the Great Crash, investors owned stockbrokers $8.5 billion. But nobody's worried. The market's rising. It's amazing. It rises steadily in the 1920s, but really takes off in 1928. In 1928, the Dow Jones is 100. What is it today? You're pretty close. You would have won the refrigerator freezer because you didn't go over. I checked it right before I came in here. It's about 25,936 or something.
Last week it was.
Yeah, it's been fluctuating.
I haven't checked it.
But you're awfully damn close. And all the years I've been asking that question, I think you're the only person who came that close. Yeah, it's around 26,000 now. In 1928, it only topped 100. Between 1928 and September 1929, it will increase 4 times over. By September of 1929, it's now at 381. So, kind of imagine that today. That means about a year and a half from now, the market would be around 75,000. Give you some idea of the huge jump within a year's time. The experts and public both were optimistic. They thought it would remain high and keep on climbing. Do you remember the dot-com craze in the 90s when the stock market was fueled by speculation and the rise of the dot-com companies? Yeah, that was the speculative bubble. And people felt the same way then that they felt in the 1920s. And in both cases, what happens to the bubble? Thank you. You're even doing sound effects today. I appreciate it. Economist Irving Fisher. You don't like Irving Fisher? Gesundheit. He said that stock prices have reached what looked like a permanently high plateau. You'll be eating those words in about a year. There were warning signs that things really weren't all that well. In the spring of 1929, months before the Great Crash, there had already been a mini crash. It recovered, so nobody paid much attention to that. And in many key industries, the ones I have been talking about, the steel industry, automobile, construction, all those industries were down. Consumers were accumulating a lot of debt they could not pay off. The 1920s saw the rise of basically buying things on credit. And again, Ford helped pioneer that. One of the ways people could afford a Model T is they put down a down payment and make car payments like we do today. That became the norm in America in the 20s. You could buy a house, you could buy a new washing machine, all of that on credit. And much like people went haywire when credit cards became very common and racked up a ton of debt they couldn't pay, people were doing that in the 20s. So there was a lot of debt accumulating among consumers in the 1920s. If you owe a lot of money, it means you don't have a lot to spend, right? So it's going to impact all these other industries. And a month before the American stock market crashes, the London stock market crashed. The biggest thing driving the rise of the stock market, though, as I pointed out, was speculation. It was only going up because people assumed it would keep going up, much like the dot-coms in the 90s. In 1928, if you bought a share of RCA, it cost you $85 a share. 1 year later, that share was worth $505. It increased 5.5 times over in a year. You're shaking your head. RCA didn't pay any dividends that year. What does that mean? What's a dividend? It's a share of your profit in that corporation. So if RCA didn't pay any stockholders dividends, what does that tell you about the company? They didn't make any money that year. And yet their stock went up 5 times over. Well, as they say, what goes up must come down.
Is RCA, that's American television?
Yeah. Yeah. And we're looking at the big bubble burst.